If you think states are born from dynasties in orderly succession, Prussia will change your mind. Its origin is an identity crisis, a religious order defeated, indebted, and subordinated to Poland by the Second Peace of Thorn. Then a Grand Master, Albert of Brandenburg-Ansbach, seizes the opportunity of the Reformation to dissolve his vows and transform the remnants of the Teutonic Order into a secular duchy. Out of this improbable act of rebellion and reinvention, the Duchy of Prussia was born in 1525. A fragile state, dependent on Polish favor, yet animated by an emerging sense of autonomy and purpose. From this uncertain foundation, Prussia evolved through ambition, discipline, and relentless adaptation. It grew from a remote Baltic frontier into a powerful kingdom, and eventually into the core of a unified German empire. The history of Prussia is the story of transformation, of faith into reason, of defeat into power, and of order imposed on chaos. On the Baltic coast in the early 1200s, faith and frontier met head-on. To the west stood Latin Christendom, with bishops, monasteries, and merchant towns tied into Hanseatic routes. To the east and along the coast lived Prussians, Lithuanians, and Livonians, tribal societies with their own sacred groves, warrior elites, and trading ties north into Scandinavia and east toward Rus. The region carried grain, timber, furs, and amber down rivers to the sea, but it also carried raids. Christian merchants and missionaries arrived alongside sword-bearing escorts, and the line between commerce, conversion, and conquest blurred fast. Popes began issuing calls for crusade not only to the Holy Land, but to the pagan north. These northern crusades offered indulgences and spiritual privileges similar to those granted for campaigns in the Levant. That meant nobles from the empire and beyond could fight seasonally in the Baltic with a moral license and legal backing. The logic was straightforward: sanctify warfare, organize it under ecclesiastical authority, and channel it toward permanent conversion. With that backing, military colonization could claim the language of salvation while establishing new dioceses and bishoprics. Enter the Teutonic Order, a German-speaking military brotherhood that originally ran a hospital for pilgrims in the Holy Land. Over time, it took on a knightly character, mixing monastic vows with battlefield roles. When opportunities appeared in the Baltic, the order found a mission that suited its structure. It promised to secure trade routes, defend missionaries, and create a stable Christian polity where ad hoc crusading bands had failed. Crucially, it brought a corporate model, recruitment across Europe, standardized rules, and leadership that could plan multi-year campaigns rather than single-season raids. Zeal and method defined their advance. They fought winter campaigns over frozen marshes to move heavy equipment. They used river lines to supply sieges, and they paired mounted knights with crossbowmen and engineers. Their operations aimed to shock, fortify, and hold, not merely raid. Villages were reorganized under new parishes, and settlers brought plow techniques and field systems that produced surplus grain for export. Control meant more than garrisons. It meant courts, tithes, and a clear chain of command that made resistance costly and coordination easier for the occupiers. The signature of that control was the Ordensburg, the order's brick fortress. Built on river bends, trade nodes, and tribal centers, these castles multiplied into a lattice of power. From there, convoys could move safely, tribute could be collected, and musters could assemble without waiting for distant lords. The fortresses trained men, stored equipment, and projected authority all year. Over decades, the habit of ledger-keeping, garrison drills, and scheduled inspections formed patterns that lasted well beyond the medieval frontier, fed a culture that treated organization as a weapon. That culture showed up even in symbols. The Teutonic Knights wore black crosses on white cloaks, a stark device that announced identity at a distance. Centuries later, the same visual idea inspired the German Iron Cross, a design that survived political systems and still appears in modified form in the Bundeswehr. By 1309, the order had shifted its headquarters from the Crusader world to the Baltic, and a new center of gravity had formed. Fortified ports began exporting grain and amber in regular volumes, while missionary bishops worked alongside administrators. The Baltic frontier had become a laboratory for fusing piety, logistics, colonization into a durable machine, one that would define power in the region and seed habits that future rulers would inherit, refine, and take far beyond the coast. When the order moved its capital to Marienburg in 1309, the tempo changed from raids to routines. Campaign seasons gave way to ledgers, visitation schedules, and a chain of command that reached from the Grand Master's audience chamber to parish villages. The fortress itself became a nerve center. Workshops, storehouses, chapels sat inside layered walls, and courtyards doubled as mustering grounds. From here, orders ran in writing, sealed and archived. Decisions had timelines, and administrators tracked obligations in neat columns. The shift turned crusade habits into governance. Knights still wore habits and carried swords, but now they signed charters, appointed votes, and audited bailiwicks. They parceled land to settlers under German town law, fixed dues, and set market days that tied rural producers to fortified towns. In Livonia and across Prussia, commanderies became district capitals, each with officers for finance, justice, and provisioning. The order's rule worked like a monastery overlaid on a barracks. Silence in the refectory sat beside drill in the yard. Monastic vows framed daily life, but military orders determined public order. At the top, the Grand Master acted as both an abbot and a sovereign. He presided over a chapter, issued statutes, and convened councils, but he also negotiated truces, collected tribute, and approved campaigns. Ecclesiastical courts handled marriage and moral cases, while secular benches tried theft, debt, and disputes over land. Bishops operated, but under a watchful eye that kept diocesan power aligned with the order's priorities. Theocratic did not mean chaotic. It meant that law and liturgy reinforced each other in service of rule. Money flowed because the system linked faith to trade. The order tapped into the Hanseatic League through ports like Danzig and Elbing, moving grain and timber out and finished goods in. Amber from the coast brought steady revenue under strict monopoly rules. Control of the Vistula's lower reaches let officials tax river traffic, warehouse goods, and time exports with convoy protection. Customs posts, weighhouses, and fixed tolls turned geography into income. With that, treasurers funded garrisons, repairs, and seasonal expeditions. Growth carried friction. Forced baptisms and parish tithes landed alongside labor obligations for road work and castle repair. Native Prussian elites lost legal standing and influence to German-speaking officials. Resistance smoldered as tax demands rose when the frontier patrols seized livestock in punitive raids. Meanwhile, Poland watched the order handle Polish-speaking burghers and nobles into contested zones, and resentment deepened as lawsuits over borders and church rights piled up. The order's courts offered procedure. They also delivered the outcomes its officers needed. The outward look sold sanctity and strength. Gothic vaults hovered over chapel halls, while narrow windows and arrow slits told a different story inside. Chants marked the hours. Armor clattered on stairwells between Mass and muster. Processions carried relics past wagon loads of salt, wool, and iron. It appeared holy and administrative, but always slightly martial, like a prayer scored for drums. Marienburg, the great brick colossus on the Nogat, anchored the image and the system. It was the largest brick castle in the world, a modular complex that housed archives, treasuries, and the Grand Master's quarters behind layers of gates. Centuries later, propagandists would use its silhouette to claim an inheritance they did not earn. For the Order's own time, its size matched the political ambition, a headquarters for a state that promised order and salvation, and collected both in cash and obedience. As the 14th century advanced, the apparatus worked, till war arrived with sharper lessons. The peace built by ledgers and walls met a problem that numbers could not fix. Poland and Lithuania, once rivals on the frontier, bound their crowns through Władysław II Jagiełło and his cousin Grand Duke Vytautas. This partnership ended the Order's favorite justification for war. No longer could it claim a lone pagan behemoth on its eastern flank. Lithuania's baptism and Poland's legal clout combined into a coalition with manpower, horse archers, and a shared interest in opening the Vistula trade without paying for Teutonic toll gates. Border raids turned into planned campaigns, and diplomatic notes carried weight the Order could not shrug off with a sermon and a siege. In 1410, the armies met near the twin villages known as Grunwald and Tannenberg. The Order expected to win with discipline, heavy cavalry, and fortified camps. Instead, coordination between Polish banners and Lithuanian columns produced a long, grinding fight that broke the rhythm of the Knights' charge and reform tactics. Infantry held where shock usually shattered lines. Lithuanian withdrawals drew out pursuers and stretched cohesion. Polish reserves struck when the Order's best units were committed. What looked like another set-piece contest became a war of endurance, and the White Cloaks folded under pressure they had trained others to endure. The irony cut deep. A military order founded to rally Christendom lost to Christian neighbors who used better timing and depth. Commanders fell, standards were taken, and the battlefield prestige that once filled recruitment halls drained away. Surviving officers tried to hold the defensive grid, but the chain that linked castles into a system now pulled against itself. Garrisons waited for relief that never arrived on schedule because treasury chests ran light and negotiators had to buy time with promises. Marienburg, the great showpiece, faced siege. Its walls still impressed, but the aura around them dimmed. The Order scrambled for mercenaries and loans, mortgaging lands and privileges to keep defenders paid and granaries stocked. Repairs ate into reserves. Soon, ransoms for captured leaders and arrears for soldiers multiplied the liabilities. Each payment deferred collapse, each delay deepened the hole. The first piece of Thorn forced indemnities without ending the rivalry, making every toll hike and tax increase a spark for unrest among towns that already handled most of the region's commerce. Losses on the field rippled through the rest of the system. Credit tightened, suppliers demanded cash, and Hanseatic partners looked for safer margins. Officers bickered over priorities. Some argued for retrenchment to core territories. Others insisted on new offensives to reclaim reputation. Lawsuits with Poland multiplied alongside skirmishes, but paper victories could not restore fortresses or refill granaries. The sacred mission sounded thinner when sermons preceded tax collectors at town gates. The memory of Grunwald grew while the Order shrank. In Poland and Lithuania, the battle became a civic touchstone, retold in chronicles, legal arguments, and festivals. Centuries later, the name Tannenberg would be repurposed by another regime to wrap a World War I victory in medieval echoes, proof that symbols outlived the circumstances that forged them. The Teutonic Order did not vanish, though. It shifted south and west, narrowed its scope, and lived on in Austria as a religious institution for centuries more, and today endures as a Catholic charity, with the habit, but without the armies. By the mid-1400s, the order's officers were counting coins, not victories. Towns had had enough. Merchants in Danzig, Elbing, and Thorn faced toll hikes, forced loans, and interference in guilds that cut into profit and autonomy. Nobles complained that legal appeals ended where the order's needs began. Out of this mix came the Prussian Confederation, a formal coalition that pooled influence, pledged mutual defense, and prepared a legal case against their rulers. They framed their cause as a protection of ancient rights and stable trade, knowing that moral claims travel farther when they ride with grain fleets and tax receipts. The coalition did not stay local. Delegates crossed into Poland with petitions that accused the order of misrule and asked for the Polish crown's protection. Poland saw leverage. Supporting the Confederation promised access to ports and river routes and the chance to weaken a longtime rival without facing the full cost of conquest alone. What began as grievances turned into war when Polish backing encouraged towns to expel order officials and raise their own banners. Garrison commanders who once collected dues now faced blockades funded by the very merchants they used to tax. The conflict that followed, the 13 Years' War, dragged on through sieges, sea raids, and shifting alliances. Urban militias and hired companies fought alongside Polish levies. The coastline mattered as much as the fields. Whoever held the ports could finance the next campaign. Credit and contracts became weapons. The order pawned estates to pay soldiers. Confederation cities financed fleets to cut supply lines. The tempo wore down fortresses that had stood unchallenged for a century. Each season erased a little more of the aura that had made subjects hesitate and creditors patient. When peace came in 1466, it redrew the map and rewrote relationships. Western Prussia, with Danzig and other key cities, entered the Polish realm as Royal Prussia, keeping many privileges under Polish sovereignty. Eastern Prussia stayed with the Teutonic Order, but on new terms, homage to the Polish king and obligations that signaled dependence, not parity. The hand that had once blessed war now presented a vassal's oath. Ceremonies gave the humiliation a script, kneeling, vows, seals, so no one could miss the hierarchy on display. Kneeling had consequences beyond pride. Vassalage meant oversight, tribute schedules, and an open channel for subjects to appeal to Krakow when conflicts arose. Towns learned that Polish courts could temper the order's demands, and they used that path to defend trade freedoms and municipal law. The order's claim to speak for a universal mission rang thin when it needed permission to confirm privileges or raise funds. Each request underlined how far the balance had tipped since its high tide at Marienburg. That imbalance seeded the next turn. If authority came from vows and a crusading charter, dependence on a Catholic king exposed a fault line. Officers sold offices to cover arrears, recruitment faltered, lawsuits consumed time and cash. The framework still stood, castles, districts, archives, but the legitimacy that once glued it together began to peel. A solution would come not from revival of monastic zeal, but from a legal rethink that treated the state like an estate, transferable, heritable, negotiable. The spirit that drove the Confederation outlived the war. Merchant cities like Danzig became engines of free trade and civic assertiveness, a pattern seen again centuries later when port movements and labor organizations helped pry open rigid empires, the Soviet Union included. The model was simple and durable: organize, leverage markets, and attach demands to the flow of goods and credit that rulers cannot ignore. Decades of war losses, shrinking revenues, and reliance on Polish protection left the Teutonic Order running on ceremony more than power. Commanderies still kept files and collected dues, but creditors pressed harder, mercenaries demanded cash up front, and towns appealed to Krakow when demands grew heavy. Vassal obligations turned grand strategy into routine paperwork, and the aura that once held the system together faded into habit. Officers debated retrenchment or revival, yet neither option solved dependence on outside lenders and the Polish crown's oversight. Into this stalemate stepped Grand Master Albert of Brandenburg-Ansbach, a Hohenzollern with family ties that reached into the Holy Roman Empire and the Polish court. He traveled, consulted theologians, and watched the Protestant Reformation reshape the rules of legitimacy. The old formula, monastic vows, crusading mission, papal approval, no longer guaranteed resources or authority. Albert read the map differently. If sacred purpose could not sustain sovereignty, then legal engineering might. He proposed a trade, end the religious state, keep the territory through a new title, and stabilize revenue under a secular framework. In 1525, he executed that plan. Albert dissolved the monastic rule across Prussia, converted its lands into personal and hereditary holdings, and swore fealty to the Polish king. The ritual looked familiar: oaths, seals, witnesses, but the outcome was new. The Duchy of Prussia emerged, recognized as a fief under Poland, yet governed as a secular polity. It carried a clear distinction. Where an order had once ruled by vows, a duke now ruled by dynastic law. With that, Europe saw its first Protestant state, a jurisdiction built not on crusade, but on administration. The break signaled a shift in how rulers used religion. Confessional stance turned from cause to instrument. Protestant identity offered coherent schooling, moral discipline, and clerical structures aligned with state priorities. Church lands, once reserved for monastic use, now funded schools, stipends for pastors, and a lean bureaucracy. Parish visitations cataloged literacy, attendance, and property, turning faith into data the government could act on. The old fortress network still mattered, but the center of gravity moved to desks and registers. The duchy treated governance like a craft to be learned. Officials mapped estates, standardized dues, and kept cadasters to prevent leakage of revenue. School ordinances aimed to train clergy and clerks who could read statutes and draft clear reports. Courts simplified procedures to move cases from oral wrangling to written verdicts that could be archived and cited. Loyalty meant more than fealty. It meant predictable service, audited accounts, and timetables for everything from tax collection to militia musters. These habits did not make Prussia rich overnight, but they gave it traction. Trade followed order. Königsberg's port handled grain and timber with better scheduling, and convoys reduced losses to piracy. Weights, measures, and tolls were written down and enforced with fewer exemptions. That reliability encouraged merchants to finance shipments across seasons rather than gamble on favorable moments. Small gains compounded, steadier customs income, more credit on better terms, and a workforce that trained to file, count, and plan. The Prussian homage, when Duke Albert knelt before the Polish king in Krakow, later gained a second life in paint and memory. Jan Matejko immortalized it centuries afterward, fixing the scene into national lore. The twist is geographical and political. The same square in Krakow would witness the Polish crown's collapse before the state shaped by the very administrative methods that began there. The duchy had traded swords for ledgers, but it kept the will to organize. That, soon enough, mattered to neighbors west of the Vistula. Shift west to Brandenburg, an electorate with marshy borders, scattered enclaves, and a vote in the Holy Roman Empire that mattered more than its tax base suggested. Its rulers sat in the Imperial College, weighed in on the election of emperors, and managed frontiers facing Pomerania, Saxony, and Poland. The land backed deep mines or alpine passes, but it held river routes and crossroads that connected Baltic trade with central German markets. Influence here grew from procedure, alliances, and steady paperwork rather than flashy conquests. The Hohenzollerns already governed Brandenburg. A junior branch, through Duke Albert, held the distant Duchy of Prussia, a legacy that tied the family's fortunes to two legal spheres. In the empire, Brandenburg enjoyed imperial immediacy, answering directly to the emperor. In Prussia, the line held a Polish fief, a status that required homage eastward. That split forced careful diplomacy. It also sharpened a habit: treat titles and treaties as tools, document every right that might later be consolidated. Consolidation meant closing gaps across a chessboard of counties and lordships. The family purchased claims, negotiated swaps, and married into neighboring houses that could deliver corridors or rights of succession. They cultivated favorable rulings from imperial courts, stocked archives with certain copies, and kept envoys on regular circuits to estates and diets. Each clarified privilege made the whole easier to tax, defend, and inherit. Progress rarely made headlines, but it accumulated. Two towns embodied the reach and the problem. Berlin anchored Brandenburg, sitting on the spree and drawing artisans, guilds, and court servants into its orbit. Königsberg stood far away on the Baltic, a ducal capital tied to grain exports and the routines of a Protestant administration. Between them stretched Polish lands, duchies, and different laws. Yet both answered to the same house. Couriers ran schedules, legal drafts traveled for signatures, and cadasters in each center slowly adopted matching formats so that numbers could be compared and policy coordinated. Marriage policy served as both foreign and domestic policy at once. Matches brought dowries in cash or territory, mutual defense clauses, and, most valuable, contingent claims when lines failed. Contracts spelled out guardianship, regencies, and rights to call estates. The dynasty also invested in record-keeping. Chanceries standardized formulas for grants and enfeoffments, audited toll stations, and mapped estate obligations. When religious tensions rose across the empire, these routines kept revenue flowing and avoided costly improvisation during confessional disputes. Religious change pressed in on every side. Lutheran ideas moved with students and printers. Catholic princes formed leagues. Imperial diets argued over jurisdiction and church property. The Hohenzollerns managed these currents with cautious alignment, maintaining order in towns that depended on trade rather than zeal. They supported schools that trained clergy and clerks, ensuring sermons and statutes did not pull institutions apart. Stability made creditors patient and kept soldiers paid during short campaigns on exposed borders. Patience paid off in quiet ways. Forts along the Oder and Netze secured customs points. Canal and road repairs shortened haul times. Standard measures reduced fees lost to dispute. With each improvement, Brandenburg and the Prussian Duchy looked less like accidents of history and more like a system designed to function across distance. That outlook shaped symbols, too. The red eagle of Brandenburg and the black eagle of Prussia began to appear together in heraldry, a visual promise of unity that later took the form of a double-headed eagle under imperial colors, signaling a broader claim that lay ahead. Europe slid into open conflict as confessional lines hardened and alliances cracked. Imperial edicts met local resistance, princely agendas collided with town interests, and foreign crowns funded proxies to tilt the balance. Armies no longer marched for brief campaigns. They stayed, quartered in villages, and ate the countryside bare. The 30 Years' War began as a struggle over religion and jurisdiction and grew into a rolling disaster that pulled in the Holy Roman Empire, Sweden, Spain, France, and countless minor states. Borders meant less than supply lines. Authority meant less than whoever held a magazine and could pay this month's troops. In 1618, amid this turmoil, Elector John Sigismund of Brandenburg inherited the Duchy of Prussia through dynastic rights, creating a personal union across hundreds of miles and several jurisdictions. Brandenburg stood inside the empire under imperial law. Prussia remained a fief tied to the Polish crown. One ruler now had to balance two legal frameworks while war reshaped both neighborhoods. That union promised scale but delivered headaches, split chains of command, separate estates, and different obligations to outside powers that could not be ignored when soldiers camped at the gates. John Sigismund's position grew more tangled because faith did not line up with politics. He was a Protestant prince who had to keep the Catholic emperor calm, reassure Lutheran subjects, and manage Calvinist advisors within his own court. Confessional labels carried tax consequences, legal privileges, diplomatic openings. A misstep could cost subsidies, spark unrest, or invite a hostile army invited by co-religionists to keep order. Pragmatism, not zeal, kept the machinery turning, even if that disappointed zealots on every side. The war's everyday reality taught hard lessons. Requisitioning stripped barns in Brandenburg. Plague followed moving columns. Fields went untilled after spring levies carted off seed grain and draft animals. Towns negotiated contributions to avoid sack, then faced the same demands from the next army. Population fell in wide stretches of the Mark. In that pressure cooker, the Hohenzollerns learned that survival depended on organization. They kept rosters, recorded inventories, and tracked arrears as if bookkeeping could push back famine. Diplomacy matched administration. Envoys shuttled between Vienna, Warsaw, and Stockholm, trading neutrality pledges and transit rights for breathing space. Military weakness forced adaptation. Brandenburg's field force shrank at points to fewer than 5,000 soldiers, a number that measured not only lack of men, but lack of money, horses, and powder. To keep even that nucleus functioning, officials experimented with regular taxes, war commissaries to buy provisions, and rudimentary magazines near river crossing. They studied supply routes and began to map which warehouses could feed a regiment for a week. It was crude, but it was a start, and it separated units that could move from crowds that only looted. As campaigns dragged on, commanders discovered that discipline mattered as much as courage. Units that marched on time and kept files closed could avoid encirclement and hold bridges long enough for negotiations to work. Those same habits filtered into civic life. Councils met on fixed calendars. Edicts standardized weights and measures to cut disputes during emergency purchases. Even the mail gained reliability, because late reports cost more than new uniforms. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 ended the slaughter and confirmed a political reality the war had revealed. German princes held recognized sovereignty within their territories, including the right to manage religion and conduct limited diplomacy. That settlement gave Brandenburg Prussia the legal elbow room to plan beyond survival. It did not grant wealth or security, but it validated the methods honed under duress. The seed was planted. Limited troops, careful books, and steady envoys could grow into a system that, in time, would make the state stronger than the armies that had once occupied it. The 30 Years' War left Brandenburg Prussia hollowed out. Fields empty, towns thin, treasuries drained. Frederick William took the electorate in 1640 with a clear aim: rebuild the core and never again let outsiders dictate survival. He started with administration. Councils that once bargained with the states for every tax now answered to a tighter central chancery. He appointed loyal officials to oversee revenue, standardize tolls, and cut exemptions that bled income. The war had taught him that scattered authority meant slow response, so he made authority direct and the paperwork fast. Security required more than walls and treaties. He created a permanent army funded in peacetime, not improvised after a crisis. War commissaries purchased grain and fodder under rules that reduced theft and inflated invoices. Drill manuals and muster rolls kept units at workable strength across winter quarters. Garrisons sat on river crossings and depots rather than in picturesque castles. The force stayed small compared to France or Austria, but it existed every month of the year and could move when couriers arrived, which was the point. That force needed money, and money needed control over the estates. The Junkers dominated local justice and could rally peasants if provoked. They also wanted status and steady income. Frederick William offered both: commissions in the officer corps, privileges tied to service, and legal backing for manorial rule, on the condition that they support taxes and accept central oversight of the army. He cut through regional diets by negotiating separately and then enforcing uniform levies. The effect was to turn formerly independent power brokers into a command structure loyal upward. Foreign policy gave him opportunities to trade action for leverage. Sweden, Poland, and the Habsburg Emperor each needed allies at different moments. Frederick William joined campaigns when the price was right, withheld it when it was not, and demanded concrete returns for troops on the march. The payoff came in 1657 at Wehlau, when Poland recognized full sovereignty over Ducal Prussia. That legal shift removed the old feudal leash. Later settlements confirmed it. With suzerainty gone, the Duchy and the Electorate could be planned as one system. Population and skills were the next constraint. He opened the door to refugees, notably French-speaking Protestants expelled by tightened policies in their homeland. They brought weaving methods, glasswork, banking contacts, and habits of urban craft organization. New neighborhoods rose in Berlin, Frankfurt on the Oder, and along the Oder and Spree. He granted tax holidays, workshop privileges, and protection from guild barriers so they could start work fast. Grain surpluses had a market. Cloth exports gained variety. Credit lines lengthened. Infrastructure followed the ledger. Canals and repaired roads shortened transport times between the Oder, Elbe, and Vistula corridors. Customs posts adopted standardized rates to reduce the petty bargaining that stalled shipments. Depots stored grain for the army and for sale during bad harvests, which stabilized prices and reduced riot risk. These were small steps, but together they changed how the state reacted to stress. The tone of the regime remained austere, purposeful. Frederick William visited arsenals, reviewed accounts, and quizzed officials about powder quality and bridge repair schedules. He obsessed over cannon casting and supply contracts, yet he never wore a uniform. That fixation passed to his heir, who would turn thrift and drill into a social code. For now, the core achievement stood: a disciplined army anchored by taxes that the ruler could levy, and a population policy aimed at production as much as piety. That combination gave the Hohenzollerns room to claim more than an electorate. It placed a crown within reach. Frederick III stepped into power with a clear agenda he did not hide: raise status, polish the dynasty's image, and convert the machinery built by his father into rank recognized across Europe. He liked ceremony, but he also understood rules. Titles came from law as much as from armies. That mix of vanity and paperwork suited the moment. Brandenburg, Prussia had resources and a standing army, yet it still sat awkwardly in the imperial hierarchy. The family controlled scattered lands that worked together, but on paper, they looked like a patchwork beneath bigger names. Here was the dilemma he meant to solve. Inside the Holy Roman Empire, Brandenburg remained a vassal, bound to the emperor's legal order. East of that, the Duchy of Prussia stood outside imperial law, a leftover from the Teutonic world. That gap mattered. It created a space where a Hohenzollern could claim a royal title without challenging the imperial monopoly inside Germany. Jurists drew lines on parchment, and Frederick learned to read between them. If a crown could not be worn of Prussia under current constraints, it might be worn in Prussia, anchored in the duchy's special status. War gave him leverage. As the War of the Spanish Succession opened, Emperor Leopold I needed loyal contingents to keep fronts staffed and allies steady. Frederick offered soldiers, subsidies in kind, and a pledge of dependable support. In return, he pressed for recognition of a royal dignity tied to his eastern lands. Negotiations stretched over details that seem fussy until they decide sovereignty, wording in patents, ceremonial precedents, and the precise form of homage inside imperial diets. Step by step, he traded concrete military help for symbolic capital that would last longer. The payoff came in 1701 at Königsberg. In a carefully staged ceremony, he crowned himself king in Prussia. The preposition did the work of a treaty. It avoided a direct challenge to the imperial authority within Germany, while still announcing a rank that lifted him above other electors. Banners, oaths, and processions filled the day, down to ranked nobles, foreign envoys, and clergy who certified the act with blessings and signatures. The coronation created a kingdom not by conquest, but by exploiting a legal opening that others had left unused. The show had purpose beyond theater. Dignitaries watched a court that looked the part of a European power. Tailors stitched uniforms and livery to a standard. A mint struck medals that traveled with merchants and officers, carrying the new title into pockets across the empire. The court calendar filled with audiences that linked the new crown to patronage networks stretching from Berlin to the Baltic. Diplomacy suddenly moved faster because the signature at the bottom of letters now carried royal weight. Prestige depended on culture as much as on rank, so Frederick invested in institutions. He founded an Academy of Arts and Sciences and patronized scholars who could give Berlin a learned profile. Printers secured privileges, mathematicians got stipends, and salons drew officials and writers into the same rooms as generals and financiers. The city gained a reputation for study and debate, modest compared to Paris or Vienna, but enough to claim seriousness that matched the new title. Berliners had their verdict on his taste. They called him the ostentatious. The label stuck because the spending was obvious. The coronation crown glittered with gold, pearls, and diamonds, and the bills rippled through the treasury long enough that regiments missed paydays. That tension, pomp against thrift, would define the next reign. The court looked magnificent. The ledger frowned. And in 1713, the man who inherited the crown set out to correct the balance with drill, austerity, and a plan to turn prestige into power that could march. Frederick William I inherited the crown in 1713 and stripped the court down to tools he could use. He sold jewels, dismissed entertainers, cut festivals, and turned palaces into barracks or offices. Coaches and liveries gave way to uniforms and ledgers. He hated pomp and treated waste as a crime against security. That attitude became policy. Ministers learned that a neat account book earned more favor than a flattering speech, and budgets followed the same logic year after year. Pay the army first, fund administration next, and leave little for ornament. Out of this came the military state. He standardized taxes to feed a war chest that never slept, and he kept spending predictable enough that creditors trusted his signatures. Barracks rose in market towns. Depots held grain and powder at river crossings. Drill fields cut rectangles into village edges. The message was clear. Prussia would live by order, not display. The army grew to about 80,000 men, huge relative to a thin population, and it stayed ready in peacetime. Units did not disperse after a campaign. They trained, audited equipment, and kept rolls accurate down to missing buttons. Discipline had a civilian twin. He built a bureaucracy that operated like a staff headquarters. The General Directory merged finance and war administration under one roof, so the same office that counted thalers also counted muskets. Decrees fixed formats for reports, deadlines for replies, and penalties for delay. Inspectors traveled on set circuits and wrote evaluations in plain language. Promotion came through service records, not salon favors. The result was dull on the surface and powerful underneath, a machine that moved resources without drama. Manpower policy matched the ledger. He introduced cantonment, assigning districts to supply recruits for specific regiments. Peasants trained under their future officers, went home for harvests, and reported for drills on schedule. This reduced desertion, cut costs, and kept the economy functioning while the army stayed strong. Towns owed quotas, officers visited parishes with lists, pastors recorded ages and health in parish books that doubled as recruitment files. The system blurred the line between village life and military duty. His quirks showed in one famous project, the Potsdam Giants. He sought very tall soldiers for a showpiece regiment, paying bounties, pressuring allies, and, at times, abducting prospects across borders. Foreign courts sent tall men as gifts. Painters elongated figures and portraits to please him. It was pride and obsession in one unit, drilled to perfection and paraded as a living emblem of reach and resolve. Authoritarian habits did not stop him from reforming the state's mind. He pushed compulsory primary schooling, trained teachers, and printed catechisms and primers that taught obedience alongside reading. Literacy served the army and the treasury. Clerks filled posts with fewer errors. Contracts read the same across provinces. Recruits understood commands written as well as spoken. Examinations for civil posts narrowed favoritism and made standards visible to anyone who wanted to rise through work. He still collected curiosities and rare books, a private concession to knowledge within a life of drill. He even traded a company of his beloved tall soldiers to the Austrian emperor for a cache of rare Jesuit manuscripts. Height earned its parade. Learning earned shelf space. Leisure, however, had no place on the schedule, and the state learned to keep time the same way a regiment keeps step. He took the throne with a different toolkit than his father. Frederick II read philosophy in the morning, drilled regiments by noon, and played the flute at night. He valued argument, verse, and mathematics as much as cadence and cadence steps. He walked through depots questioning ration weights, then debated history with scholars over supper. The court shifted from parades to discussions. The army did not soften. Files closed tighter, marches moved on time, and the staff practiced map work as a daily habit. His opening move as king reset the chessboard. In 1740, he marched into Silesia, a wealthy Austrian province with booming textiles, water-powered mills, and taxable estates. The legal pretext rested on old succession claims. The true calculation was strategic. Seize a compact, rich region while Vienna reorganized after Maria Theresa's accession. Bridges fell in sequence, fortresses faced concentrated artillery, and Prussian battalions kept linen-stiff lines under fire. The first test came at Mollwitz. Cavalry missteps nearly lost the day, but infantry drill and steady volleys forced the field, proving that training could rescue innovation when plans wobbled. Those gains drew a wider circle of enemies. The First and Second Silesian Wars pulled in Austria and its partners. Frederick answered with speed. He cut supply routes, pressed winter operations, and maintained pressure until new treaties fixed Silesia in his hands. When the 7 Years' War erupted, the coalition hardened. Austria, Russia, and France converged with more men and deeper treasuries. Prussia met them with a smaller army that moved faster, hit flanks, and lived out of magazines placed with care months before the first shots. 3 names mark the method. At Rossbach, oblique movement and feints disoriented a larger Franco-imperial force. Prussian lines struck where cohesion faltered and turned a crowded advance into a rout. At Leuthen, shifting weight along a concealed march brought disciplined volleys onto the Austrian flank, delivering a clean, destructive victory on open ground. Mollwitz remained the reminder that infantry steadiness mattered when cavalry surprises went wrong. Each field showed a variant of the same principle: line logistics, timing, and geometry, so that a smaller force solves a bigger problem. The price was high. Prussia endured sieges, defeats, and near collapse. Yet the state held together because staff work coordinated garrisons, depots fed columns, and reserves filled gaps the moment casualty lists arrived. Finances stretched, but audits kept credit credible enough to buy grain and powder. By the war's end, Europe ranked Prussia among the great powers. Inside the German lands, it became the standard for discipline, planning, and battlefield nerve. Frederick's government did not stop at the drill yard. He sponsored legal codification to reduce contradictory rulings, streamlined appeals to speed verdicts, and pressed officials to answer petitions with reasons, not delays. He supported religious toleration, inviting talent without testing creed, and he handled minority confessions with rules that preserved order while broadening the pool of skill. Schools gained funding, academies attracted mathematicians, historians, and natural philosophers, and censors balanced the ruler's sharp pen with a pragmatic tolerance that kept printers busy rather than rebellious. Between campaigns, he composed flute sonatas and staged intimate concerts, sometimes in the shadow of recent marches. Voltaire praised the mix of conqueror and artist, a neat label for a reign that married thought to force. The next phase would measure how a state built in war could govern the peace it had earned. The war ended with Prussia standing, but the price was obvious on every road and field. Gutted towns struggled to feed garrisons, draft horses were scarce, and villages counted widows as carefully as seed grain. Frederick surveyed the damage with the same focus he used on maps. He had won territory and reputation. Now he needed yields, courts that worked, and a tax base that could breathe. He shifted from campaigning to rebuilding, walking estates with stewards, hearing petitions, and setting deadlines for repairs that could be checked in the next season. He governed with a ruler's certainty and a manager's routine. Orders flowed to rebuild mills, replant orchards, and restock herds through controlled loans. He trimmed ceremonial expenses and funneled funds into roads, canals, and magazines that steadied grain prices after bad harvests. Brickworks restarted near river landings, and bridge crews got paid before festivals did. Small rules stacked up: clear field boundaries, stop petty tolls that slowed carts, and punish fraud in army contracts that siphoned public money. Justice came under the file and the pen. He pushed toward consistent procedures, fewer overlapping jurisdictions, and timetables for verdicts that cut bribery by reducing delays. Appeals moved in writing so that officials could be held to their reasons. Education fed that system. Provincial schools trained clergy and clerks who could handle registers, write plain reports, and teach basic arithmetic. Universities gained chairs in law and natural science. Cadets learned surveying as well as drill. Literacy climbed, and so did the share of local disputes settled without sending a rider to the capital. Agriculture had to carry the recovery. Drainage projects opened new acreage in the Oder and Netze basins, where marsh turned into taxable fields. Estate managers introduced crop rotations with fodder plants, improving soil and supporting larger herds. Sheep flocks grew to supply cloth workshops. Cattle numbers rose as meadows improved. He invited settlers to fill the gaps left by war, offering tax holidays and tools to get started. In towns, guilds kept their privileges, but faced rules that prevented them from blocking useful trades. Infrastructure stitched the provinces tighter. Canal work linked river systems so barges could bypass dangerous reaches and shave days off delivery schedules. Mileposts and standardized tolls cut arguments at bridges. Post stations kept regular times, with penalties for delay that kept news, order, and payments moving. Depots served both army and market. When prices spiked, controlled releases stabilized bread costs, which quieted streets and reduced the risk of unrest. Religion followed the law of usefulness. He welcomed Catholics, Protestants, and Jews if they could contribute skills, trade, or population. Communities received charters that defined rights and taxes clearly, keeping magistrates from improvising penalties or fees. That openness widened the pool of talent for commerce and crafts. It also eased external relations by dulling doctrinal quarrels that other courts were still fighting. Berlin and Potsdam reflected this practical enlightenment. Architects laid out squares and facades to regular plans, while scholars lectured on history, mathematics, and physics to audiences that included officers and merchants. Music and theater found patrons, but they shared space with academies that issued prize questions on engineering or agriculture. The mood was orderly rather than grand, a confidence grounded in schedules met, projects finished. He kept a private affection that survived the files and the marches. At Sanssouci, he chose to rest beside his greyhounds, the companions of quiet evenings after councils and rehearsals. For years, that wish sat unfulfilled. In 1991, the burial he wanted finally happened, and the stone that marks his spot lies in the terrace where he had planned, walked, and worked. Frederick the Great's death in 1786 left a strong engine with worn parts. The laws were neat, the ledgers precise, and the army drilled. But initiative had narrowed to routine. Senior officers guarded precedence more than performance, and ministries clung to forms that solved yesterday's problems. The system moved, yet it moved on rails that could not bend when conditions changed. A modern economy needed flexibility and credit networks beyond crown warrant. Prussia still preferred orders and quotas. Frederick William II stepped in with softer priorities. He liked music, courts, and private circles that offered comfort rather than correction. Mystical advisors and favorite courtiers gained influence over appointments and contracts. Investigations stalled when they touched protected names. Procurement lost bite as inspections grew social. Money went to palaces and pensions while repairs to roads and magazines waited. The crown signed debt on weaker terms, trading long-run control for short-run ease. Underneath, inefficiency spread. Promotions rewarded loyalty over merit. Regimental schools skimped on math and surveying. officers drifted toward etiquette. The General Directory, once tight, tolerated duplicate offices and overlapping jurisdictions that masked waste. Provincial officials padded accounts with small fees and customary gifts. Audits still happened, but they produced memos rather than dismissals. The aura of discipline remained, yet it masked a bureaucracy that moved slower and cost more to achieve less. Diplomacy mocked the ledger's precision. Prussia joined the partitions of Poland and gained land, town, and taxpayers. On paper, the state expanded by corridors that linked scattered provinces. In practice, it inherited border quarrels, resentful nobles, and policing burdens that consumed garrisons. European observers watched a power claim legal neatness while helping dismantle a neighbor. The moral cost eroded trust. Courts in London, Vienna, and Paris accounted for Prussia as calculating but unreliable, a partner for convenience, not a guarantor. Then, the French Revolution split the continent's playbook. Prussia chose order over experiment. Edicts censored radical texts, and envoys pressed for alliances to contain France. Yet the state faced a type of mobilization it did not understand: mass levies, quick learning in field workshops, and officers promoted for competence forged in battle. Prussian drills remained exact, but exercises assumed slow marches, rigid formations, and set-piece days that an enemy no longer offered. The army that once intimidated Europe had not fought a modern opponent in decades. Its parade ground strengths turned brittle. Artillery lagged in mobility. Staff work favored neat columns over flexible detachments. Senior command expected obedience more than initiative. When operations began on the Rhine and in the Low Countries, the adversary moved with a pace and resilience that threw off schedules. Supply was planned to the cart, not to the opportunity. Fun fact, in 1792, the confident march to crush the revolution met a wall at Valmy. Cannon and volunteers held their ground, but the advance stopped. The retreat gave a lesson the files had not. Spirit, flexible command, and mass could blunt polish and lineage. Goethe, witnessing the moment, said, quote, "From this place and this day begins a new epoch in world history." The court changed again in 1797 with Frederick William III. He preferred austerity and caution, but he inherited drift, debt, and habits set in calmer decades. He trimmed ceremony and talked reform. Europe, however, accelerated. Prussia moved, yet the ground beneath it was already shifting toward a test it had not prepared to meet. Napoleon had risen from a general of the French Republic to master of Europe by exploiting speed, mass conscription, and a cohesive command system. Prussia, confident in its parade ground precision and the memory of Frederick the Great, chose to confront him in 1806 without waiting for stronger coalition support. The state believed its drill, its cavalry charges, and its rigid line tactics would check France's core maneuver doctrine. Ministers hesitated, then committed. The army marched out in separate columns that could not support each other, while French corps moved like joints of a single organism. The result came in a single October day split in two names. At Jena, Napoleon drove a Prussian-Saxon force from the field. At nearby Auerstedt, Marshal Davout's corps, outnumbered, broke the main Prussian army under the Duke of Brunswick. Detachments collapsed, fortresses surrendered, roads clogged with fugitives, and discipline evaporated. Berlin fell. King Frederick William III retreated to the Niemen, court papers stuffed in wagons. The kingdom that had taught Europe drill and cadence lost its capital in weeks. Garrison towns raised white flags on sight of French scouts. The sting was not only territorial, it was moral. Officers steeped in ceremony found their habits useless against marching columns that lived off the land and attacked in depth. Humiliation stripped illusions and revealed how brittle the system had become. The shock opened space for a cadre who treated defeat as a license to rebuild. Baron von Stein arrived with a blunt agenda: break the grip of old corporative privileges. Hardenberg pushed legal and economic changes through diplomatic storms and French oversight. In the barracks, Scharnhorst and his circle dismantled the ritualized army, rebuilt it around training, initiative, and a national reserve. They used the catastrophe as a lever to pry open society. Serfdom was rolled back in the 1807 to 1811 measures, allowing peasants to move, marry, and work without a lord's consent. Towns gained self-government. Schools expanded under a newly energized ministry that treated education as a state function rather than a church habit, tying literacy to service. The officer corps changed from a noble monopoly to a merit ladder. Exams and staff schooling rewarded skill over pedigree. Short service conscription, reserve call-ups, and the Landwehr created citizen soldiers who could be mobilized at scale, drilling in peacetime jobs and assembling in wartime units. Behind them sat a new instrument, a permanent general staff to plan, study, and coordinate. It collected maps, analyzed campaigns, and rehearsed scenarios. Over time, its method of critical study reached far beyond Prussia, and its officers parsed even the campaigns that had humbled them. Amid these upheavals, one figure carried public feeling into politics. Queen Louise, widely admired for candor and resolve, traveled to meet Napoleon in Tilsit, seeking better terms. Her appeal failed to change the treaty, but her effort hardened a sense that the dynasty's honor aligned with national recovery. Her death soon after gave reformers a martyr whose memory gathered volunteers and donations. By 1813, the reforms began to show. Prussian units moved faster, commanders coordinated across corps boundaries, and reserves filled ranks without draining the farms. Volunteers wore black cockades and carried new confidence. In the spring campaigns, then at Leipzig, Prussia fought as a partner rather than a client. 2 years later, at Waterloo, Prussian marches and late-day pressure broke the last French stand. A state beaten to the ground in 1806 had re-entered Europe with a new identity built on institutions, training, and a learned memory of failure. Vienna gathered monarchs, ministers, and diplomats to stitch Europe back together. The goal looked simple on paper: restore borders, restrain France, and build a balance that would prevent another imperial surge. The negotiations stretched across months of banquets, private notes, and side deals. When the map finally settled, Prussia stepped away with more than restored dignity, it gained leverage. Prussia received significant pieces of Saxony, and more importantly, a long westward arm that included the Rhineland and Westphalia. This was not a neat, compact realm. The kingdom now straddled the Elbe and the Rhine, linking old heartlands in the east with dynamic towns around Cologne and along the Ruhr. Administrators scrambled to integrate new legal codes, currencies, and municipal privileges. Local elites in the West brought different habits of trade and law, and they expected consultation. That friction forced Berlin to learn new methods of management. The western lands mattered for what lay underground and along the rivers. Coal seams near the Ruhr and iron deposits in the region promised energy and metal on a scale unknown in the Sandy Mark. Waterways fed traffic to the Rhine, opening export routes that tied Prussian factories to Dutch and Belgian markets. Early mines and foundries drew workers from the countryside, and guild rules slowly gave way to joint stock capital and mechanized production. The bureaucracy, trained to count grain and recruits, now kept ledgers on furnaces, tariffs, and railway charters. This shift did not erase the army's importance, but it added a second engine: industry. Out of Vienna came a political framework as well: the German Confederation, 39 states in a loose association. Austria held the permanent residency in Frankfurt, but Prussia stood as a co-leader in practice, with influence through its territories and customs policy. The Confederation had a federal diet, committees, and rules that discouraged unilateral wars and encouraged collective repression of unrest. It was coordination by negotiation, not a state, and it left room for rivalry. Every debate in Frankfurt became a proxy test between Vienna and Berlin. Austria's foreign minister, Prince Metternich, set the tone for the era. He designed a system that favored stability, censorship, and police cooperation. Press laws tightened, universities came under watch, secret societies drew surveillance and arrests. Prussia, still rebuilding its standing, aligned with this conservative order, policing pamphlets and lecturers while presenting itself as a defender of calm. Administrators in the West enforced these measures, often against their own town's civic traditions. Inside Prussia, the new borders created a cultural split. The Rhineland and Westphalia had strong municipal councils, Roman law traditions, and a habit of public debate. East of the Elbe, the crown leaned on Junker landlords, rural hierarchies, and military routines. When Berlin standardized taxes, conscription, and school rules, it met petitions and protests from chambers in Cologne and Dusseldorf that spoke a language of rights and commerce. That tension did not break the state. It taught it to balance decree with negotiation and to use economic integration as a political tool. Customs policy became a quiet battlefield. Prussia built tariff unions across its scattered lands, lowered internal barriers, and coaxed neighbors to join. The Rhineland's merchants found advantage in a wider market. Eastern agrarians enjoyed predictable routes for grain and timber. Rail surveys traced future lines from the Vistula to the Rhine. Factories followed. One more note on the Ruhr. Early Prussian officials complained that the locals argued too much and defended their freedoms. Those arguments soon powered boardrooms, stock exchanges, and workshops that would drive a continental economy. Revolution rolled across Europe in 1848 and hit Berlin with barricades, petitions, and crowds demanding rights long promised and long delayed. Students, artisans, and merchants formed civic guards, printed leaflets, and marched under new colors. Street fighting erupted when troops tried to clear demonstrators. The king's ministers lost control of the capital for days as bodies lay in courtyards and makeshift hospitals. To calm the city, Frederick William IV stepped onto a balcony and signaled concessions. He allowed a citizen militia, promised a constitution, and for a moment that mattered far beyond protocol, he wore black, red, and gold, banner of German unity that had traveled from lectures and taverns into the streets. The momentum then shifted to Frankfurt, where delegates tried to craft a national framework out of arguments over borders, rights, and the place of Austria. While debates stretched on, the monarchy in Berlin regrouped. Censorship returned, troops reoccupied strongpoints, and the crown issued a constitution on its own terms, keeping divisive levers in royal hands. In the provinces, commissioners dissolved radical clubs, while courts processed cases of sedition and press offenses. The promise of 1848 thinned into a managed order. The Frankfurt Parliament sent envoys to offer a national crown. The offer carried conditions that made it dependent on a representative mandate. The king declined, and the project of a liberal unification stalled. Street mobilization faded under arrests and fatigue, and many leaders left for exile or quiet professional lives. Yet the language of rights and nation had entered public life in a way police files could not erase. Clubs turned into economic associations. Newspapers learned to navigate censorship with coded debate about railways, customs, and schools. In that mixed climate, Prussia chose statecraft over rhetoric. It updated rifles and artillery, revised drill, and expanded the Landwehr's role in mobilization. Staff officers mapped rail corridors for troop movement and stockpiled supplies in depots near river junctions. The War Ministry standardized calibers and pushed for domestic production to reduce import risk. At the same time, finance officials promoted credit institutions and eased rules for joint stock companies. The customs union extended its reach, aligning tariffs and encouraging trade from the Rhine to the Vistula. Rail lines linked coal and iron to workshops, and workshops to ports. Industrial towns grew work schools to train foremen and machinists who could move from factory floors to arsenals without retraining. Politics adjusted as well. Provincial diets continued to meet, but the crown shaped outcomes through appointed officials and electoral rules that favored wealth and property. Catholic and Protestant associations, once divided by confession, now cooperated on school and charity questions, creating networks that later anchored mass politics. Urban councils in the Rhineland kept their habit of negotiation, pressing for infrastructure and sanitation while accepting police oversight. Out of this period stepped Otto von Bismarck, first as a provincial representative known for sharp speeches, then as a diplomat seasoned in Frankfurt and St. Petersburg. He read the lesson of 1848 as a warning against improvised revolutions and a guide to controlled change. Unity would come, he judged, through leverage, alliances, and timed confrontations. Meanwhile, officers in Berlin received a practical order during unrest: set aside the spiked helmets in public to keep tempers down. A few decades later, that silhouette would stride across parades as a national emblem, proof that symbols often outlive the circumstances that first made them suspect. In 1862, Otto von Bismarck became Minister-President of Prussia and moved quickly to align state power with military readiness. He faced a hostile liberal parliament that rejected higher army spending and resisted plans to expand conscription and modernize command. He sidestepped budget votes, collected taxes under existing laws, and let the War Ministry complete reforms. New rifles, rail-based mobilization plans, and a refined staff system gave Prussia a toolset built for fast, coordinated action across multiple fronts. He treated Parliament as an obstacle to be contained while he worked abroad to shape outcomes. His diplomacy focused on narrow aims, limited wars, and clear exits. He wanted Prussia to lead Germans without inviting a wider coalition against it. He judged when to press and when to pause. He kept the king's prestige intact while he maneuvered behind the scenes with envoys and secret notes. Alliances were temporary bridges. Once they reached his goal, he moved on. The first test came in 1864 over Schleswig and Holstein. Disputes over succession in the Danish monarchy opened a legal path for outside intervention. Prussia and Austria entered together, defeated Denmark, and took joint control. Prussia in Schleswig, Austria in Holstein. That map looked cooperative, but it was unstable by design. Conflicting administrations, customs posts, and troop routes made friction inevitable. Bismarck pressed small disputes into larger issues, counting on Austrian caution and Prussia's speed to tip the balance when the partnership cracked. By 1866, that crack became open conflict. Prussia moved before Austria could consolidate German support. Rail timetables brought corps to the frontier on schedule, and telegraph lines kept commands aligned. At Königgrätz, superior organization and firepower decided the day. Prussia's victory broke Austrian influence in northern Germany without marching on Vienna. Bismarck prevented overreach by stopping short of total humiliation, then used the result to build the North German Confederation under Prussian leadership. Member states kept local governments but ceded control over war, diplomacy, and key finance. A federal parliament provided a veneer of representation, yet the army and foreign policy ran from Berlin. The southern German kingdoms remained outside this structure, tied to Austria and wary of Prussian authority. Bismarck waited for the right crisis to align them. He found it in 1870, when a dispute over a Spanish throne candidacy stirred French alarm. A diplomatic exchange became public controversy after the Ems dispatch appeared in edited form. French anger turned into war. The southern states activated their defense treaties with Prussia. Mobilization unfolded along rails planned years earlier, and the combined German forces moved fast into Lorraine and Champagne, winning early battles and enclosing French armies. Paris fell under siege, while new French levies tried to rebuild resistance in the provinces. German logistics tightened the ring around the capital, and artillery pressure grew while negotiations stalled. With the city starving and the enemy divided, Berlin drove the political point home in ceremonial form. In January 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, German princes hailed King Wilhelm I as emperor. The empire rested on military integration, managed federalism, and a bureaucracy trained for precision. The map of Germany had new lines, but the method, limited wars, force backed by industry, and careful diplomacy, remained the core of Prussian statecraft. Versailles in 1871 turned victory into architecture. In the Hall of Mirrors, German princes recognized the Prussian king as emperor, binding the new empire to the prestige of a conquered palace. That setting mattered. It announced that the wars had produced not only a larger state, but a hierarchy with Prussia at its peak. The constitution that followed embedded this order, federal on paper, centralized in practice, with the imperial chancellor answering to the Kaiser more than to the Reichstag. German defined the borders. Prussian defined the workings. The King of Prussia sat as Kaiser. The imperial army kept Prussian drill, regulations, and command habits, and the civil service ran in the clipped cadence of Berlin's ministries. War and foreign policy flowed through institutions built before unification and scaled up after it. State railways synchronized timetables for troop movements. The General Staff expanded its planning bureaus, filing studies for every frontier. Provincial identities remained, but the levers of power used the Prussian template. Bismarck then worked to freeze Europe in a manageable shape. He built overlapping agreements that reduced uncertainty and raised the price of adventurism. The Three Emperors League eased tensions with Austria and Russia. The Triple Alliance secured Italy, held Vienna close. He kept France isolated without forcing it into desperation. At home, he policed opponents and watched budgets closely. He let national pride vent in parades and anniversaries, while he cautioned the court against risky wars that could wreck a favorable balance. Culture became a battlefield. The Kulturkampf targeted Catholic networks, placing clergy under state oversight and restricting church influence in schools and appointments. The campaign met resistance in the Rhineland and beyond, and over time, the government rolled back parts of it. Bismarck then shifted tactics, turning to social policy. He backed accident, health, and old age insurance through compulsory schemes managed by the state and employers. These programs were designed to undercut socialist appeal, but they also made the empire an early laboratory of welfare governance, linking workers to institutions that recorded births, injuries, contributions, and claims. After 1890, a change at the top fractured the old caution. The new Kaiser dismissed Bismarck and favored a louder role abroad. Naval plans multiplied, and fleets demanded steel, coal, and shipyards. Colonial ventures in Africa and the Pacific carried flags into new maps and sparked international disputes. Industry surged as Ruhr mines deepened and Rhine ports expanded. Chemical works and electrical firms turned laboratories into export engines, while cartels and banks knitted together capital, suppliers, and state contracts. Growth fed confidence. Confidence nudged policy toward display. Berlin transformed at the pace of steam and steel. Elevated railways, new stations, and factory districts pulled workers from countryside and province. Avenues hosted veterans' marches, while trade fairs exhibited turbines and dyes. Uniforms filled public life, from cadets in drill yards to reservists at railway platforms on mobilization days. Newspapers reported tonnage and treaties side by side, teaching readers to read production as power. The mood carried pride and an edge of impatience. Beneath the ceremony lay an imbalance. Federal titles hid the weight of Prussia inside the imperial system. Over 60% of the army and a vast majority of officers wore Prussian colors, and the emperor's crown rested on the Prussian throne by right. The empire spoke many dialects, but commands still sounded in the cadence first set east of the Elbe. That arrangement delivered order and speed, until speed began to outrun caution, and order bent to the demands of a restless age. Europe entered 1914 with alliances locked, crises unresolved, and armies timed to railway schedules. The Prussian-shaped German Empire sat at the center, confident in staff work, mobilization tables, and a belief that speed could solve politics. When war came, planners launched a strategy that sent the bulk of forces through Belgium toward Paris, aiming to defeat France before turning to the east. The concept favored precision and tempo, corps moving on parallel roads, timetables measured in hours, and a home front primed to sustain the surge with coal, steel, and grain. Early weeks seemed to validate the method. German columns pushed deep into northern France, forcing Allied retreats and creating the sense that a decisive outcome was close. Then, the front hardened. Rivers, fortified positions, and exhausted units slowed the pace. Entrenching tools, barbed wire, and machine guns turned open warfare into a line that stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland. Attempts to outflank the enemy only extended the stalemate. The operational art that had promised motion now managed attrition. Industry became the battlefield's engine. Shells, propellant, rails, and replacement rifles mattered as much as tactics. Mines fed furnaces, furnaces fed guns, guns consumed men. The General Staff expanded planning to cover ammunition quotas, harvest forecasts, and transport priorities, integrating factories and farms into a war calendar. New fronts and new weapons multiplied demands. Submarines drew neutral powers into disputes. Air reconnaissance adjusted artillery fire. Poison gas forced masks into every kit and deeper shelters into every trench system. As months turned to years, authority concentrated in committees, quartermaster offices, and staff headquarters. Civil ministers deferred to military priorities. The Kaiser receded from public decision-making, while generals and logistics directors issued orders that reached into bakeries and schools. Food shortages grew under blockade pressure and failing harvests. Families replaced meat with ersatz substitutes, coal deliveries missed, winters bit harder. Faith in the old order thinned as casualty lists lengthened and promises of breakthrough faded. The Eastern campaigns moved but did not cure the strain. Territorial gains could not offset the drain of men and material. Occupation zones required garrisons and supplies. Allies needed support. The home front coped with strikes and protests, then crackdowns, then new pledges that the next offensive would pay the debt. Newspapers printed maps and production targets to keep morale steady, but rumors and grief spread faster than official communiques. By 1918, the empire gambled on a final push in the West before American strength could arrive in full. Initial advances bent the line, then stalled as reserves ran short and logistics lagged behind the gains. Counterattacks bounced the momentum back. War weariness tipped into refusal. Sailors mutinied rather than sail on a sortie they viewed as pointless. Workers marched, councils formed. The system that prized obedience found units and cities acting on their own. Leadership broke. The Kaiser left command to others, then left the country for exile. Authorities proclaimed a republic to prevent chaos and to seek an armistice. Monarchy's long line, which had once anchored the state's identity, ended in a matter of hours. A new government faced the burden of surrender, demobilization, and hunger, while the argument over blame began to harden into legend. When Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated, he reportedly asked if he could take his generals with him into exile. The answer was no. The war ended, and the Hohenzollern crown disappeared with it. The Old Kingdom's territories did not vanish, but the monarchy did. In its place, the Weimar Constitution recognized the Free State of Prussia, a republican state that still covered more than half of Germany's land and population. Its government tried to hold a balance: strong ministries, a large police force, and an educational system that kept schools running through strikes and currency shocks. The Prussian parliament debated budgets while provincial offices administered forests, canals, and railways. Even stripped of a king, Prussia remained a machine built for governance. That machine carried a reputation. To many Republicans, Prussia meant uniforms, titles, and obedience. To radicals, it looked like the anchor of an old regime inside a new constitution. Its size and administrative reach made it a counterweight to instability, but also a target. Struggles in Berlin often turned into contests over who controlled the Prussian Interior Ministry or police presidency. In the Ruhr, workers' councils clashed with officials sent from the capital, and the state used emergency decrees to reassert control. Courts heard cases testing how far the new republic could trim the powers that had once served the king. The 1930s ended that debate by removing the arena itself. After seizing national power, the Nazi leadership folded federal structures into a centralized system. Prussia, the largest and most institutional state, presented both an asset and a threat to that plan. In 1934, a law abolished the Prussian government and redistributed its functions to Reich ministries and regional party officials. The name lingered in maps and in some legal titles, but the state's separate identity was over. Many instruments of control the regime prized, civil service discipline, police files, planning habits, had roots in Prussian practice, yet the regime wiped out the framework that had housed them. Defeat in 1945 raised a different question. What to do with the state that outsiders blamed for Europe's wars? Allied authorities dissected borders and institutions. They viewed Prussia as the source of a martial tradition that had pushed Germany toward repeated conflict. In 1947, an Allied decree dissolved Prussia as a legal entity. Its eastern lands passed to Poland and the USSR. The rest became parts of new states within the divided Germany. Capitals changed, records moved, and provincial administrations were rebuilt under occupation rules. On paper and in law, Prussia ceased to exist. The irony cut in two directions. A discipline that once knit a scattered realm into a power strong enough to unify Germany now served as evidence against it. Administrators who had once proud memories of order watched their very state declared a problem to be erased. Yet, habits survived departure. German classrooms kept a focus on trained teachers and standardized curricula. Ministries continued to file, audit, and plan with care. Local police and civil registries maintained the deep records that make welfare states function. Railways ran to tight timetables. Inspectors signed off on bridges and boilers. Memory persisted as well. Museums in Berlin, Potsdam, and former provincial capitals kept uniforms, maps, and ministerial cabinets. Scholars revisited reforms, weighing whether the culture of service prevented or promoted catastrophe. Public debates traced lines from Landwehr musters to modern reserve systems, from early school laws to today's vocational tracks. The name is gone from the map, but the habits remain in roads, ledgers, and classrooms, and in family stories about officials, soldiers, and teachers who thought of the state as a craft. Prussia proved failure can build empires, turning defeat into discipline and vows into systems. Others followed: Meiji Japan, post-war France, city-states reborn through structure, not sentiment. Subscribe for more history that rebuilds your perspective.